I'm going to tell a story today about innocence and the media and how a particular portrayal of children as innocent is used by the media to attract readers and to manipulate our emotions. In a crowded media environment, childhood is referred to in media reporting to sharpen the public's feelings of moral outrage or urgency as victims of commercialism, obesity, or an oversexed culture. Innocent children focus our sense that we're all going to hell in a handbasket. But if childhood is represented in this way, always in the context of the brink of disaster, as perennially threatened, blameless and helpless, other ways of representing and experiencing childhood are eventually squeezed out, as the media comes to be saturated with images of imperiled children jostling for our attention. This situation demands critical attention from the general public and not only from academics. The story I'm going to tell is about my first engagement with the media as a supplier of content about childhood innocence, when I lost my media cherry, as it were. I'll talk first about the ideas that animated this ill-fated encounter, and then I'm going to talk a little about how these ideas fared in that forum, how perhaps any idea that aims to criticise the taken-for-granted assumptions about children is likely to fare in the media. The twist in this story concerns my own loss of innocence, and I say this with tongue only partly in cheek, because there is an aggressiveness, a hastiness towards, and a resistance to complexity of thought that characterises a particular style of engagement that is currently threatening entirely to engulf the public sphere, and which despoils the innocence of any attempt to intervene or reflect on what can be said within it. That's how my story will go. But as I'll show you shortly, according to the media in the story that emerged in the latter half of December last year, I was the enemy of innocence. Little old me, because I was ruining childhood for children and adults both. So my story began when I wrote a book. The book is called, as we've heard, The Importance of Being Innocent, and it's a modest attempt to look at the ideas adults hold most dearly regarding children and what childhood should be, and what's at stake for adults in particular, in this particular culturally dominant portrayal of children. So my argument in the book proceeds briefly as follows. 1. Our ideas and experiences of children are mediated. They're mediated by cultural representations of childhood found in fairy tales, traditions, institutions, and media reporting, which then mutually reinforce one another and are in turn reinforced by adults' nostalgia for their own childhood, often conceived as a simpler time, a time of less worry and of less responsibility. 2. These representations and stories of childhood innocence organise how children's behaviours and speech is then able to be interpreted, and the manner in which it's possible to value children. And we can reflect on this idea in relation to our own experiences with children, that sometimes there are moments when they do or say something that doesn't quite mesh with the idea of childhood innocence. And in these moments of what the French philosopher Jacques Rancière calls dissensus, or disruption, this image of innocent childhood is destabilised. When we're then forced to either reconcile children's actions and speech to our idea of innocence, which may indeed mean seeing that child as an aberration, or we can question the singular portrayal of childhood as innocent. 3. Because the ideal of innocence, of what the innocent is allowed to do, is very limited, then the repertoire of behaviours and types of speech that are acceptable for children to perform is also limited. So that's to say, the kinds of actions that do not look like childhood innocence, especially when they're performed or discussed in the public sphere, attract censure and expressions of disgust. angelic children quickly become monsters when they don't comply to the representation of them as innocent, as ignorant or sweet or passive and compliant. Such behaviours cannot be made sense of. They disturb a sense of decorum and must then be put right again through expressions of public outrage. 4. The ideal of public innocence conceals the material conditions of its own existence. So that is to say, children are only innocent if they are uncontaminated by the toils and imperfections of adult life. And they can only be kept separate from the adult worlds of work, sex and political action when there is sufficient wealth invested in them so that they can be withdrawn from the sphere of production. So they can have their own rooms in a house, they can go to school, they can in general be taken care of. And indeed, the innocent child is a mark of a society's affluence. So, just to be clear, I'm not saying here that it is a bad thing that children should be protected from the harshest vicissitudes of adult life. But what do we make of children then who cannot afford to be innocent, whose innocence is not protected because there's no material support devoted to its preservation? If we cannot find alternative ways to imagine childhood and value children other than in terms of innocence, then middle-class children will be denied means of participating significantly in the life of the community. And children in poverty, and disproportionately in this country, that means also Indigenous children, will be overlooked, vilified, felt to be an embarrassment to the community because they trouble our notions of childhood. They don't look innocent to our eyes. 5, and finally, the ideal of childhood innocence is comforting to adults because it speaks so intimately to our dearest fantasies and tenderest sense of our own vulnerability. But to this extent, it also provokes a sense of crisis and danger. And it is into this scene that the popular media enters. Because each of these volatile emotions, the sense of crisis and danger, are searching for an outlet and are easily recruited by anyone with an interest in persuading people of their views quickly, firmly, and without recourse to reason. It is not only children, then, who are affected by the discourse of innocence. Adults can also be manipulated by it to take views they might not otherwise, or they might otherwise be more critical of. So the take-home message from the book, just to put that aside, is that there's a need to find other ways to imagine and to represent children and what childhood means. And this critical reappraisal of childhood must be a public enterprise. There's a role for the media in this also, but it is the media up to this challenge? That's my question. So here begins the story of my encounter with the media. It's 2 weeks before Christmas, and a journalist from the Herald Sun has been reading my book. She contacts me through my publisher, saying that she loves the book and would like to help me promote my message. Over the course of a couple of phone conversations, she succeeds in gaining my confidence and seduces me with the praise of my work, and because I'm an academic, that doesn't take much to do. She assures me that she's done a PhD in postmodern women's studies, so she knows where I'm coming from. And I really believe her, because when she repeats back to me what she takes to be the book's argument, this does seem to reflect a sympathetic understanding of my book. But the story will hang, she tells me, on one line in the book, a line that questions the value for children of the Santa Claus story. It's Christmas, and this is a topical angle bound to catch readers' attention. Sure, it simplifies significantly the book's message, but the story will spark a conversation about these ideas. And she says these are Hun readers, right? With a surprising lack of faith in the people who consume her own work, she assures me the story oughtn't to be too complicated. So to clarify and to put it in its context, the point of the single line about Santa Claus was to urge reflection on the question of who and what children's belief in Santa serves. The conventional view is that it nurtures children's imaginations and thereby preserves their innocence. But children's belief in Santa also enables adults to reconnect to their own lost childhood, to relive a nostalgic stage of life when it was okay only to receive, and to indulge their imaginations in the contemplation of what childhood should mean. The crucial difference between children's and adults' relationships to Santa is that adults know they are making believe, and children, for the most part, do not. Children then mediate adult fantasy and are objects of adult fantasy, but do not knowingly participate in the creation of this imaginary world. The purpose of the line was merely to promote reflection on the dividends for adults of children's innocent belief. So the interview then becomes more personal. And I make the mistake of talking too personally. The journalist asks about my own children, whether they had believed in Santa Claus, and I tell her that I regret having lied about Santa to my eldest child. The story is then published the next day in 3 forms: as a news story, an opinion piece, and a blog post, each of which are syndicated to other outlets across Australia. But they pursue what is for me a surprising turn of argument. I'm characterised in these stories, predictably enough, as participating in the erosion of Christianity and as, quote, part of a trendy approach to childhood popular in many universities that treats kids as some fancy academic exercise. I spend the rest of the day on Talkback Radio, fielding questions about whether I think children are psychologically damaged by the Santa Claus myth. In the 2 minutes I have each time to clarify my argument, I'm returned again to the question of whether I think belief in Santa is dangerous to children and whether such belief even puts them at risk. So that discussion of my argument is returned to the formulaic representation of children as passive and imperilled by ordinary life. There's no room for subtlety in this context. And with each interview, I'm slam-dunked by the radio presenter and dutifully play my part as the batty boffin who's out of touch with the lives of real people. Meanwhile, readers speculate on online forums about the extent of my children's misery and ponder what a waste of taxpayers' money I am. The vitriol directed toward me by now reaches quite an intense pitch. The next morning, I politely knocked back more requests to do talkback, this time from America and Canada. Finally, just before Christmas, I find myself listed at number 1 on the National Post's Humbug Index, and a right-wing American blogger again regurgitates the story under the heading, "Liberals Ruining Childhood One Step at a Time." So if I'm not merely a victim of my own naivety in this instance, I'm certainly a victim of global journalism, chewed up and spat out by a media beast that remains apparently impervious to any critique or analysis on offer. But there's a sense too in which I was also a victim of my own success. I had argued that adults are conceptually and emotionally over-invested in a particular relationship to childhood, imagined in terms of ideals and practices that support an interpretation of children as innocent, such as Christmas Santa rituals. Should it then be any surprise to me that these ideas might be met with antagonism, even rage? My question to the media in the aftermath of this singular media encounter is who has the power to change opinions and to provoke real debate about the meaning of childhood in Australia? As an academic and a writer, it's true that I enjoy a privileged access to institutional knowledge and am credited, rightly or wrongly, with some kind of authority. But I am in no better position than anyone who's had any interaction with children and any experience of interpreting media to think critically about how children are represented and what this might entail for adult expectations of them. What can be said and understood about children depends on how it is said and in what context, so that the placement of children always as at risk, if uncritically accepted, limits such understanding. And it's not only academics sitting in their obscure ivory towers who have a particular interest in representing childhood in a certain aspect. The mainstream media has an investment in presenting childhood as innocent and imperiled because that's how they attract readers and produce a buzz, measurable by the reactions of their readers in comments pages and forums. The ubiquitous messages we receive about childhood are not, however, only counted by out-of-touch academics, but also by real people with real lives, people with children, who are equally able to reflect critically on the ways that childhood is represented and how this influences their parenting practices and the manner in which their children's lives are circumscribed. Some are even real enough to be journalists. Some of you may remember the American columnist Lenore Skenazy, who visited Australia on a media tour last year to talk about the free-range parenting movement and sparked debate about children's capacities and the limitations placed on them by adults' fears. And while many felt threatened by her urgings to send kids to the park on their own, many others expressed a sense of relief at this suggestion that they weren't being urged to be afraid continually. It's possible to question the ever-present characterisation of children as innocent and helpless without being a postmodern trendy academic, like myself. The confluence of bias embedded in the practices of the media as an institution and the public's insatiable hunger to be emotionally stimulated has produced the conditions in which it is increasingly difficult to imagine childhood as anything other than in crisis. As responsible citizens and parents, however, we can intervene in this trend and should do so, I dare say, for the sake of the children.